you'll be able to see your name, and on the right, you'll see a tab for more, and you can put in, there's an opportunity for rename, and you could put in your, please put in what group you'd like to be in, either birds or bats, BB, or MM for marine mammals. And that way Cameron, who is our technician today, can put you into the correct breakouts. And that's something you can do at any point throughout. And I'll remind you again before the breakouts to do that. The chat function is a great place to put in questions and also to ask Cameron for technical assistance. You can either chat everyone or direct chat, and most of you, I think, know how that works. Cameron's email is chager@cbi.org. If everything goes haywire on you and you need assistance getting back on, he can help you do that. So next slide, please. Just some basic ground rules about navigating our conversation. Again, I think many of you are familiar with these, but if we could be attentive to the objectives for today's conversation, and Amanda Cross is going to go through those with us. Focus on our task. If you could, try to avoid multitasking, which is very difficult in this Zoom world that we're living in. But listen to learn and speak to share your expertise. There are many of you in this room, this virtual room, that have expertise that we're really hoping to learn from. I will do our best to make sure we can share the floor so everyone is allowed to participate, and of course be direct, but also respectful. And I also did want to let everyone know that the session will be recorded. So, if in case others want to go back to it, it'll be recorded. And if that's a concern for anyone, just please let me know. So I think that those are some of the things I wanted to cover at the beginning. I wanted to remind everyone that this is the purpose of these work sessions, is to think about where a potential research array could be sited. And we spent some time on that before, and Amanda's going to share with us some of the thoughts from work session 1. And what kind of research, what can we learn as we move forward with the idea of a small research or a research array within the Gulf of Maine? What kind of lessons can we learn about floating offshore wind that will inform us as we move forward? So as a way to remind us about the last session, and also to get a sense of the folks that are on the phone today, I want to put up a quick poll that I would like you all to answer. And Cameron, if you can put that up, it should pop right up on your screen. And what I wanted people to ask, is just sort of what aspect of the first work session did you find most interesting? Was it learning about the offshore wind research array itself, Wing's presentation on birds and bats, the presentation on marine mammals, your discussions either in the birds and bats mammal breakout group, or there was nothing that really stuck out to you, or you might not have attended the first session, which is good for us to know as well in terms of how much we might need to make sure that we bring people along with what was covered the first time. So I can see folks answering that. We have roughly 65 of you, I think, on the phone today, which is terrific. And I will just let this run for a little while. All right. Oh, I see a couple more putting in votes here. I think we might be at our end. So if you want to share, Cameron, the results so everyone can see that. So roughly learning about the research Maine's offshore wind in general, people appreciated both the presentations on marine mammals and the discussions of breakout groups. But there are about, a quarter of you that didn't attend last work session, so welcome, and we will try to make sure we point to the various things to bring you along with what those conversations were. And part of that actually is Amanda Cross is with the Inland Fish and Wildlife, and she is going to quickly give us a brief overview of what we heard at that first session and then share the objectives for today's work session. So I'm going to hand it over to Amanda to go through that with us.
Great, thanks so much, Laura. Welcome back to those of you who attended the first session on March 5th, and welcome to about the quarter of you that are new. We very much are appreciative of the time you're taking to have a seat here at the table and provide your input. As Laura said, my name is Amanda Cross. I'm a wildlife resource supervisor at the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. And as a reminder from our first work session on March 5th, and as an introduction to the quarter of you that are new here, the purpose of these sessions is to have an open dialogue around the data sets and information needed to inform Maine's proposed offshore wind research array. Our March 5th discussion and those today will help inform 3 areas of the project decision. So the siting of the research project and its configuration, the research themes of interest that could be addressed through this project, and any other relevant elements of project design that should be considered. So you're here today, and I said it last time, but I'll say it again because it's important. You're here today because of your expertise and your knowledge about the wildlife in the Gulf of Maine, about the Gulf of Maine in general, from marine mammals to bats to seabirds to neotropical migrants. These work sessions are designed to help foster a collaborative open dialogue among the most pressing issues that we need to consider in the design of this research project, as well as identify those opportunities to fill gaps in our data sets around Maine wildlife. Your participation in these working sessions will help inform the research project with the best information available. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are big conversations. So we've broken them down into several different work sessions. As a review, in our March 5th work session that was attended by around 85 people, we focused on our knowledge of wildlife in the project area of interest. Notes from that meeting, if you haven't had a chance to review them or are new to this process, are posted on the Governor's Energy Office's Offshore Wind website. And I think Stephanie just posted a link to them there in the chat box. Take some time to look at those notes in your spare time. You should have also received a link to those notes in the invitation email that you received as part of this work session. Since that March 5th session, many of you also provided additional data links and information as part of the Google worksheet that we shared during the first meeting. And so thank you to everyone who contributed to that. We really appreciate that extra homework that you took on in between sessions. Today, we're going to revisit some of those data discussions, and then we're going to dive more deeply into considerations of array configuration and potential research questions. Then finally in April, we don't have a date on this yet, but I think April is the timeframe we're aiming for. We're planning for joint work sessions with the Fisheries group to identify intersecting themes and ideas around siting and design. And those meetings will be announced as soon as we have them set, both through email as well as on the website for this project. Next slide, please. So what is our plan for today? So our first objective is to provide updates to the wildlife data discussions from March 5th. I'm going to take a few moments here, particularly for folks who are new to the table or considering it was almost a month ago at this point, to go through what we talked about. So we're all starting out sort of on the same page. So during the March 5th meeting, we discussed spatial and other types of data that are available for this region, including where we have data gaps. In terms of siting, our conversations focused on the scale of the data available for the project area, and that much of that information comes from regional models, such as the MDAT information available on the Northeast Data Portal. We also had discussions around other types of data sets, so tracking data and local data to help supplement this modeled information, but some of these data sets are really limited in this area of interest. We also talked about the use of environmental covariates, such as sea surface temperature and bathymetric characterizations, and how those could serve as proxies for data deficient species. And we also talked about some potential areas of higher marine mammal and seabird use associated with Jeffries Ledge and Platts Bank. As a follow-up to those conversations in a few moments, we'll hear from Carl Wilson of the Maine Department of Marine Resources, who will walk us through some of the sighting information that we touched on in that March 5th meeting, look at some of the maps that we've talked about, and then also some of the themes that have emerged from the fisheries sessions. Then we'll hear from Dr. Wynne Goodall of the Biodiversity Research Institute, who will talk about some possible refinements and approaches to applying some of the data sets that we identified in that first work session and how that can be used to further inform research siting. Okay, so that's all objective one. It's a big one. Our second objective for today is to discuss possible configurations of the research array to reduce interactions with wildlife and answer key questions. Then our third objective for today, if we go back one slide to take a look at those all together, our third objective for today is to identify potential key research questions that we want to answer during the life of this project. And then finally, we'll talk about those next steps and how you can continue to be engaged in these discussions moving forward. Okay, now we'll take a look at the agenda. Okay, so we have a full agenda today. As I mentioned before, up next are Carl Wilson and Wynne Goodall to provide us some updates. Then we're going to talk about configuration. You'll have a short break, bio break, attend to what you need to do. Then when we return, we'll talk about the research themes that we want to consider as this project. And as Laura mentioned, we'll go into breakout groups, and please identify yourself in your name if you wish to go to BB, so birds and bats, or MM, marine mammals. We'll provide you with another reminder if you haven't gotten a chance to do that yet. We'll spend some time in those breakout groups, kind of digging into research ideas. Then we'll come back together, share what we've learned, hear from one another, wrap up, and discuss next steps. Full agenda, a lot to tackle, but we're going to do this together. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carl Wilson. Carl is the director of the Bureau of Marine Sciences with the Department of Marine Resources, and he'll be talking about his initial thoughts from the fisheries work sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Carl, you want to tee up your slides?
Sure thing. Thank you. And thanks everyone for showing up today. And just let me know, Laura, when you see the slides.
I see all of them. So I see
Okay.
it. There we go. DMR's role.
Okay.
Initial sighting criteria.
Perfect. Hi. Okay, so again, I'm with the Department of Marine Resources. I head up our Bureau of Marine Science, and a small team of us within the department have been trying to support the Governor's Energy Office in trying to kind of thread the needle and find some candidate areas that have less conflicts with some of the commercial fishing. And so just wanted to give you a little quick summary of what we've been hearing. And I did see in the chat that somebody is experiencing thunder and lightning showers, and literally as I hit share, the thunder started hitting mid-coast as well. So if I leave you, I leave you. So just stepping back a little bit, some of our sighting criteria that we are looking at is, again, 20 to 40 miles offshore in 150 feet of water or deeper. We're looking in the southern half of Maine, and this is relative to the two likely connection points. One of the two likely connections points would be either Wyman Station in Cousins Islands, or the former Maine Yankee site in the Sheepscut River in Wiscasset. Looking for gravel or mud bottom and areas with minimal conflicts with known fishing activity or current use. We want to try to avoid highly trafficked areas and also limit visibility from shore. So taking the big view, outlined in red is the area of interest. And just from this perspective, you can see that we're in the southern, southern half of the coast of Maine. The area is anchored on the southern end by Platts Bank here that I'm I'm circling. Western side, Jeffrey's Ledge. On the eastern side, there's an area called Toothaker Ridge that roughly defines that area. If we zoom in, we can see from the fisheries perspective, this crosses 3 lobster fishing zones, Zone D, Zone E, and Zone F. It's also, this area is dominated by the eastern and western approaches to Portland, the 2 shipping channels. And we also have this pink area kind of running through the eastern third of it, and that is a Department of Defense exclusion area. Again, the red line is 20 miles, statute miles. This is the 12 nautical mile line, and this is the 24 nautical mile line. With regard to fisheries, and I think this is a general theme that might be emerging from the wildlife discussions as well. Even at the surface, there's a strong connection down to the bottom, and it's really kind of anchored by the underlying bathymetry and physical conditions of this area. And so from kind of some detailed bathymetric data that is available, you know, we can see that this is a very diverse area. There's shoals around Platts Bank, Toothaker here to the east, and Jeffrey's Ledge to the west. And then there's also some kind of dynamic areas at the end of the eastern approaches, shipping lanes as well. This area in the northern third actually wasn't available until the last couple of weeks. This is kind of our first look at some of this bathymetric data that was just made available through the NOAA hydrographic group. And so this is really added dimension and context to some of our conversations as we have been talking with fishermen and also trying to look at kind of the publicly available data. And really our objective in working with fishermen is that there is this combination of public data. So this is data that's readily available on the Northeast Data Portal. And this represents various fishing activity through vessel monitoring systems, sometimes through harvester trip reports and other methods as well. Unfortunately, we have some fisheries and activity that is very poorly understood in this area as well. And so that's where we've really tried to work with individuals who are, you know, willing to pick up the phone and have a conversation. I will say, you know, kind of as an overarching theme, we have not talked to any fishing industry community members that are in support of wind. However, we have had some very constructive discussions that have helped us understand kind of where not to site. No individual is telling us where to put the eventual research array, but it is providing the context of how some of these fisheries and multiple users interact in this space has been very informative. So to just roughly characterize recreational fishing in this area, and again, this is something I think you'll hear a theme that starts now around structure. Structure is very important. Platts Bank was identified as kind of one of the last remaining places for reliable ground fishing for recreational vessels. But really anywhere that you see kind of promontories sticking up out of the seafloor or edges seem to be an important part for recreational fishing activity. This also cuts across many fishing sectors as well. Lobster fishing is one of our fisheries that we have minimal data. For one, this is in excess of 20 miles from shore, and so it gets a little bit harder for the department to have observers on vessels, and so we have kind of limited data from our standard monitoring programs for lobster. And then the way that the federal lobster fishery is characterized in Maine at least, is that 10% of harvesters are required to report daily catch reports. And those catch reports, as far as spatial data, only come across as distance from shore and zone fish. So we had zone E, F, and E, D, E, and F, and the distance from shore is 0 to 3, 3 to 12, or 12 plus. So this area is only kind of characterized as a big block outside of 12 miles. However, when we start to and talk with fishermen, what we find again is that structure is important, depth is important, and time of the year is important. And really, what we've heard is that really down to 90 fathoms or so, you're going to have if we were to site this inside or shallower than 90 fathoms, we're going to start to run into significant conflicts with the lobster fishery. If we were to site this in an area that has structure or kind of really defined edges, that's going to also create conflicts with the lobster fishery. And there are portions, say, deeper than 90 fathoms that are fished occasionally by the lobster fishery, but it may only be on a seasonal basis. And so generally speaking, if you add kind of bathymetry to our understanding of what the lobster fishery is doing, is that anything in red or yellow is probably going to be fished quite extensively by the Maine lobster fishery. The blue and the green start to show a little bit less activity and maybe a little bit less conflict as far as sighting goes. Again, this is a theme that you're gonna hear from other fisheries as well. If we move to the multi-species or ground fisheries, we have the luxury, I guess, of looking at vessel monitoring systems. And so these are GPS trackers that are mounted on the vessels and that ping every 30 minutes. And so the composite images of those pings allow some spatial representation of the fishery. And so if we look at 2015 to 2016, we can see quite a bit of activity in the western portions of our area of interest. And this turns out that this is a very actively fished, heavily fished tow that borders the western Gulf of Maine closure, and you can kind of see this line here. There's also some activity around Platts Bank, but much of the rest of the area of interest does not have much activity, maybe a little around the shipping lanes here. But there isn't that much activity. As we started, again, talking with the ground fishery participants, context is everything. And one of the first suggestions that we had was you're looking at the wrong years. And in fact, if you pull up the years of 2011 to 2014, you see a much more dynamic and a much more contextual image of what the ground fishery is doing in this area. So again, you have this area in Western Maine that is showing high activity right up against the Western Maine groundfish closure. Platts Bank is very well defined. You still have activity around the eastern approaches, but now to the east, you have quite a bit of definition on some of the activity. And this is actually a tow, a groundfish tow that is avoiding a wreck that is on the eastern side of this, of our area of interest. If we, in trying to work through this in a relatively broad perspective, if we look across all fisheries, you kind of come back to this map that I was discussing earlier around lobsters. And if we work from kind of west to east and just talk about activity and where we would have difficulty and conflict in sighting, in the western area, and we'll talk about marine mammals in just a second, but you have the Western Maine closure for ground fishing. You have a major fishing groundfish area between Platts Bank and Jeffries Ledge. You have the shipping channels on this western portion. Platts Bank is seemingly used by everybody at different points of the year or at the exact same time. It's a high very, very high conflict area. And as you go further in the shore and further to the east, your lobster activity, and of course I was just talking about the eastern portion of the groundfish activity as well. So that leaves us at the conclusion of kind of where we are now with our fishing activity is this kind of middle blue area as showing the least conflict as far as having multiple fisheries or very high numbers of participants as well. Although I am a lobster biologist by training, I was asked to touch briefly, since we are in the wildlife group, to touch briefly on how marine mammals might impact some of our sighting. And this is where I think it comes right back to there's kind of some underlying physical features of our area of interest that set the stage, whether it be the bathymetry, the oceanographic conditions, or the current conditions in the area. And so this is a map pulled from the Northeast data portal again that talks about all baleen whale. It's just a summary figure of all baleen whale abundance. And we're zoomed out a little bit, but here is our area of interest. And again, it's showing relatively higher abundance around Platt's Bank and Jeffrey's Ledge, and then to a lesser degree, less abundance of baleen whales to the east. For reference, you may have heard there's a proposed right whale seasonal closure for the inshore lobster fishery, and this is the purple box that is being discussed for that as well. On the subject of right whales, and just as an example of how kind of one summary picture doesn't exactly paint the entire picture, there are seasonal differences with any of the marine mammals that you want to look at. This is an example for right whale, looking at abundance again, and just looking at the color intensities between January, May, and October. And so there are clearly seasonal differences in this one example, but I'm pretty sure that you can go through any species and see this example. And as Amanda and I were talking about this session, it sounded like some of the conversations coming up in the wildlife discussions have been about transit potentially through this area. And I wouldn't really be able to speak about that for marine mammals. We might be able to get that into that around the breakout sessions. But I think that would be one of the challenges for mammals is to thinking about how they would be, moving in and moving out of this area. And I know that that's come up extensively in our conversations around lobsters and whales as well over the years. So I think with those points, I can stop. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And if we get too deep into the marine mammals, I'll probably raise the white flag. And we have Aaron Summers from the department as well on this call. And there's others as well. I just saw Linda Dowdy come into the call as well. And so there's people with much more experience around marine mammals than myself. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Carl. That was great and really helpful. We did have a couple questions pop up in the chat while you were talking, and I was wondering if you could go back to the last two slides, the last fisheries, this one. Now to clarify, first question I think I saw was, is this basically an overlay of the lobstering data with the multi-species data?
This is,
go ahead.
The red is simply a bathymetric mass. So that's just looking at bottom depths that are greater than 90 fathoms or around 540 feet or so.
Okay.
So, but I think it relates very well to the activity of, it describes kind of where the lobster footprint is, which we really didn't have prior to these conversations. And then you kind of combine that with the groundfish activity, which is really centered around this Western Gulf of Maine closure and this big fishing toe to kind of stretching between Jeffries and Platts Bank being very important, and then the eastern portions as well. This middle area is fished, but at a lesser degree.
Okay, so the ask, and something to think about as these presentations continue to evolve, the ask was an overlay then of taking this and the multi-species, I think.
I got you. Yeah.
Presentation.
The way that I would say that is, we're going to be submitting an application, and I'm sure that our fisheries siting discussions will kind of be, integrated into that. And so what we envision is a way to kind of quantify the publicly available data as well as our kind of interview-based data to form a composite map that would kind of give you the yellow, orange, red kind of conflict areas where we see for sighting.
Great, that's helpful. Jeff, before I go to you, the other question that people had was, is there a way, and maybe you can just do it with this scale here, I don't know, Carl, that you can show what the 16 square miles
Absolutely. Yeah.
looks like?
Yeah.
When in relationship though to like those things, like, go ahead.
In relation to the colors, the bathymetric colors, or?
Yeah, but go ahead, see what, at least,
Okay, so
that's a
this,
square?
yeah,
Okay.
so this is a square 16 miles that I should have pointed out on my first slide here. And ultimately, this is the approximate size square, if the configuration was going to be a square, that we would want to fit inside of this area. It's clear to us we are not going to be able to fit that 16 square miles in an area that does not have some conflict with one or more fisheries. And so the objective is to try to minimize that conflict.
Got it. Thank you, Carl. Appreciate that. Jeff.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Carl. It's Jeff from TNC. First, thanks for putting this information out here. This is super helpful. I feel like we've come a long way since the first meeting that we had, having a better understanding of the use out there. And it's also really nice to see that updated bathymetry data. I know you were dying to get your hands on it, and you've got it. I guess my question with respect to that is, do you feel confident in that data as it's presented now? Is there further working up of that data that's going to happen, or do you feel that's a pretty good representation of what we are going to know about the bathymetry in the area that we didn't have very good bathymetry data before? Sure.
So I do think that it's a very accurate representation, and not surprisingly, it absolutely matches the descriptions that fishermen that we have been talking with as they kind of describe their experiences in these areas. This is the nautical chart on the screen right now, and there's this large area that has very few soundings, no lines at all, and this is the area that was added in. I think it's represented here. The mistaken ground really came in. This area just to the east of the shipping channels was really well defined, and frankly, it originally we thought it was kind of relatively broad expanses of mud, and it turns out that it's a very dynamic area, and frankly has a lot of fishing activity as well.
And Carl, are you able to infer substrate from the areas that don't have bathymetry and relief? Is it safe to assume that might be muddier type bottom than the stuff with the relief on it?
Yeah, I mean, there are better people to speak to that, but it's safe to assume that the flatter areas are going to, as it's described by fishermen, the flatter areas are mud. And Jeff, you'll be curious to learn that when you overlay the fishing grounds of Maine, that is, it's a 100-year-old document. They absolutely match up with the new bathymetry, the names and locations. So these are areas that have been visited by fishermen along the coast for over 100 years. Cool. And well known.
Thank you, Carl.
Yep.
Thank you. There was a question, Carl, that came up. I would ask also before, if if folks want to raise their hand, I think it's great, Carl, that you keep your screen up because then people can, you can refer to things. But if there's a little reactions, it's a little happy face. If you raise your hand, then I can see you to call on you if you want to ask a question. And folks are doing a great job putting questions in chats and even answering them for each other, which is terrific. But there was a question here. Are there economic data that go with the fisheries species data for lobster, groundfish, whale watching to quantify the spatio-temporal economic value across all the stakeholder and sectors? Where does that fit?
Yeah, I'm sure that's going to be part of our conversation. The issue is kind of some fisheries don't have the data in a way that is readily available. And so that's going to be a challenge. So for example, lobsters, we have to put a 10% estimate based on harvester reporting to a very broad area and make some very broad assumptions with that. And then, say whale watching, we would have to, look to economic surveys around the whale watching industry in Maine or in the Gulf of Maine to try to make some estimates about the impacts for that. Other fisheries like groundfish that do have vessel trip reports, and they do have some very nice economic, social, and community breakdowns. And so this through NOAA, through the Northeast Science Center and GARFO, and we have kind of tested those waters a little bit with the area of interest, and it's very clear, even at a broad scale, 770 square miles, that there are some prizes in the economic data. But then I think we're going to run into problems when it actually comes down to that 16 square mile area. It's just such a small dot on the scale of the Gulf of Maine and how this data is collected that it may have a mismatch, and so we're going to have to do some inference from there. So it's not going to be perfect, and we're going to have to work pretty closely with people around that.
Thanks, Carl.
You want me to stop sharing my screen, Laura?
Sure. Why don't you stop sharing? I think if we're good.
Okay.
I see a thread, and I hope people can see it in terms of asking questions about the kind of data that was used for the Baleen maps and where that's coming from. So I'm not going to repeat all those questions, but Jocelyn asked, do you have any data on tuna fishing in this area?
So tuna fishing is another federal fishery, whether it be commercial or recreational, that does not require vessel monitoring. And so we've had several conversations with people about fishing activity. Again, broadly speaking, structure makes a difference. Water depth makes a difference. But when you get in, from what I understand, when you get into the harpoon category, that's the group that's covering the largest area. And it's probably fair to say the entire area is important for harpooners, where hook tuna fishermen might be a little bit more focused on structure.
Great. I am going to have one last call, and then I think we should move on to Wing, knowing that, Carl, I know what you've presented here, you're going to continue to collect and have conversations with people over the next month in the fisheries sector. And there is going to be a fisheries meeting the 31st, which I think is next Wednesday, from 5:30 to 7:30 for the fisheries work session. So if people do want to get more into the fisheries stuff, that will be a great opportunity to do that. But are there any last questions for Carl in terms of what he presented, especially as it pertains maybe to some of the wildlife and the bathymetry you presented? I think is something that's of interest to folks.
Yeah, and well. I just want to thank Erin Summers. She's doing yeoman's work in the chat right now, explaining some of the marine mammal data. So thanks, Erin.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Erin, for doing that. And when you get in the breakout for marine mammals, if there are a few things you want to make sure you guys can clarify, by all means, do that, because those are some important questions before moving forward. All right. Any other? I don't think I missed anything. I will ask David if you saw anything that I missed in the chat.
We're good.
And if not, I will move us forward to Wing Goodall. For those of you that don't know, Wing is, excuse me, a scientist with the biodiversity, with the Biodiversity Research Institute. He has been working on questions around offshore wind and impacts since, I think, 2009, for a long time, and it's in the interaction of both with wildlife and offshore energy. And Wing's going to provide, he presented at the first work session, and really appreciate all that he put forward there, and has done some additional thinking and working with Fish and Wildlife to think about an approach that is ongoing in how to look at the MDAT data and other data to inform bird sighting pieces of the sighting question. And I think if you are ready to go, Wing, I'll let you take it away.
All right, great. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
All right, great. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you joining us again. And so just real quickly, I'm going to give a recap of the presentation last week, just in one slide, and what data we have available, and then think a little bit more through a sort of a three-step process on how can we use that data to help support sighting of the research array. And of course, it doesn't want to change slides for me. There we go. So we both are data rich and data slim, I guess is one way to think about this. We have regional models called the MDAT models, and these are models that stretch from the Gulf of Maine all the way down to Florida. And NOAA put these models together using all the available bird survey data and relating it to environmental predictor variables to give us these really incredible models that give us the relative abundance of species by season, and that's for 47 species. And that's really going to be our best data set to use. And an example of that is right here in the middle of the slide, the state listed species. We also have some local data, which I'm going to show in the next slide, that we were able to discover in the Northwest Atlantic Seabird Catalog, and I'll discuss that a little bit in a moment. There's also tracking data for a variety of species for the Gulf of Maine. This includes non-marine migratory birds such as songbirds and raptors. So you can see some track lines here of peregrine falcons moving through the Gulf of Maine. We also have some select tracking data for seabirds as well, some from colonial nesting areas, some migratory data, as well as some birds that are actually wintering up in this area. We have some additional information just on sort of general coastal use of birds, and this is generally helpful to get us an understanding of how birds are going to be using the Gulf of Maine. But just sort of refocusing back onto the MDAT models, what can they tell us? So they can tell us the spatiotemporal use of the area of interest. They can give us a sense of relative abundance through that area. They can give us a sense of differences of distribution and by season. So it's really probably our best data set to work from. And we do have some information right within the area. And this, so what you're seeing here is the data from the Northwest Atlantic Seabird Catalog. And what's most important about this image is that it demonstrates that there is some data in the area that was used in the MDAT models. So I had initially thought that there wasn't any local data available contributing to the MDAT models, but there is some, which is some good news. So it gives us some greater confidence in using those models in this area. It's important to note, though, while on one hand you look at this and you think, oh, there's quite a bit of data there. If you can see that legend, you'll see it's from data representing from 1978 to 2013. And so it's really a hodgepodge of different surveys that have gone through that area through time. So it has what's called inconsistent effort. So it's not like a systematic survey that was across the area all within the same time and space. So it's kind of tough to use it individually, but it does give us some information on what's going on there. So as you sort of drill into this data a little bit and say, well, what can this tell us about our alcids, our auks? Well, we got a couple there. What can this tell us? Is they're present. That's just about it. Can we use this to help us understand different spatial use of this area? We just don't have enough information. And again, that's why we'll rely upon the MDAT models. Loons, similar situation. We have only 5 sightings overall. And I should note that the lighter areas, sort of the squiggles on this image, those represent other track lines. So you can see where we have data and we don't have data. And it's really important to understand where we don't have data. So if you don't see a dot there, it doesn't necessarily mean there isn't representation of a species there. It's just we don't have information. Sea ducks, we see sort of a mix of sea ducks across the area with some variety of species through the area. And then we also see some variety of terns, different species through the area with one roseate tern observation. Again, since these data were collected through different time and space, we can't directly use it to support, but it helps us understand at least the presence of species there, and it is some local data. So how can we best use these MDAT models? And I'm sorry, I don't have any results yet to provide anyone, but I just wanted to sort of talk through a process that we're going to use, because one of the challenges with birds is it's a very diverse group of animals, and you have to consider all these different sort of conflicting use patterns. When we look at the sort of combined data sets available from the MDAT models, they're essentially, that are on the Northeast Data Portal, they are treating each species and season sort of equally as they sandwich them together to make summary maps. And what we want to do is look at that a little differently and weight every individual species gets a different weight based upon its vulnerability to collision, displacement, or its overall population levels or conservation status, if you will. And we're going to do so based upon methods used in Kelsey et al., which is 2018, which did this kind of work for the West Coast. In Kelsey's work builds from a sort of standard approach that's been used for vulnerability here on the East Coast as well, and over in Europe. And for collision, we're going to consider avoidance rates that will come from the literature, percent of time within the rotor swept zone from the catalog data. One thing we always have to remember about anything about flight height information is it's really tough information to get at, and we have to represent and understand where biases are in that information. We also want to consider flight activity. So are the birds more likely to be sitting or flying? That's going to come from the literature and also from using the catalog as well, if that data is available. When we consider displacement, we're going to really only consider 2 factors: avoidance and then habitat flexibility. And for population, we're going to consider the proportion of population exposed. So that's where the MDAT models have really great utility, is we're able to compare overall the area of interest to the East Coast of the United States and say, hey, is this area like really important for a particular species in a particular season? When you think about it from a more population perspective. We're also going to consider, consider conservation status. So we want to think about species of greatest conservation need in Maine, and also going to consider general listing status, as well as global population trends. And then the final piece of the puzzle here is adult survivorship. And the reason we want to include that is, and this is really the case for most seabirds, are long-lived and have low reproductive output each year. So that means the loss of an individual is going to have greater potential effect on a population than a species that's shorter lived and produces more young in each year. So the idea is we're going to weigh the MDAT models for collision, displacement, population, probably have 3 separate maps. We may combine them into one, or we may just go with the three final ones that we have there. So a really interesting conversation came up at our last session about thinking about covariates. And these are, what are the environmental and physical factors that Carl has already discussed that may affect bird distribution. So importantly, what's really good to know and really useful is the MDAT models were built in using a whole variety of existing covariate information. So to some degree, the MDAT models are reflecting those relationships. And here's a couple of examples of what we can see here. So I just sort of connected an arrow here between what we see as a bathymetry map and black-legged kittiwake. And we see Platt's Bank as an area that's been identified that's shallower, that these birds are using more. Or if we consider distance from shore, we see the MDAT models are predicting that common loons, that's the lower right-hand corner, are going to have higher abundance closer to shore. And those are strong relationships. But then we can consider these together and think, if we can get further offshore and in deeper water, then to some degree, we're minimizing potential exposure of 2 species here. One thing that is important for us to know, though, around covariates is that they're going to be conflicting and uncertain relationships. So for some species, they're going to be have higher concentrations closer to shore. Some species will have higher concentrations further from shore. And also, a lot of these relationships aren't necessarily well known, and we have a fair amount of uncertainty around it. That being said, I think that it is worth thinking about, are there some sort of basic heuristics or rules of thumb that we can use that, particularly when we're interpreting and looking at the work that Carl and DMR are doing, to help us sort of relate the wildlife data to the fisheries data, which is obviously interlinked. So one question we've been discussing is there's this other set of data, the tracking data. And tracking data is incredibly useful because you have this very detailed information on individuals, but it's also challenging because often you have small sample size and limited time that individuals are tracked. But it can help us really understand migration routes, foraging areas, phenology, and can qualitatively, and we can do this potentially quantitatively, but I think it's best just to think qualitatively for the moment, relate what we know about from the MDAT models on bird distribution, and then look at what we know from the tracking studies. And so this is the northern gannet here, and at the upper right here, you see what the MDAT models show, the sort of concentration closer to shore. And what is really nice about this is we see a very the same type of relationship that comes out of a dynamic Brownian bridge model built from tracking data of that same species. So that can tell us for this species that further offshore is going to be a spot with generally lower use, relative use. For species that are not well represented in the MDAT model, the tracking data and some of the other data sets that we discussed, this can be really helpful just to help us understand what species are potentially present that aren't necessarily represented in other ways. And we can use that to help prioritize monitoring for permitting. There's a lot of different types of methods that you can use for monitoring. And so knowing the species that you think will be there, you can start to tailor what kind of survey effort you're going to do based on those species. It's also useful to help us start to set up identifying data gaps and starting up the questions of what are the research questions, because it helps us know that, okay, well, we know that some terrestrial migrants are out there, but we don't have a very good sense of, say, their flight heights when they are out there. And so that's some of the greatest utility it can provide. So with that was to sort of a quick overview of our approach, and can just sort of open up to general discussion. Had some headers here, some thoughts on, and maybe we can get into this more in some of the breakout session, but, do you have any questions about the approach that we're considering, pulling the MDAT together, any feedback on that approach? As we start thinking about covariates, are there key relationships you would like to highlight for priority species? And then we'll begin the conversation about monitoring and research questions. So with that, I'll hand
Thank
it
you,
back.
Wing. Yeah, I'd like to open it up to those sort of first questions about your approach and any feedback and the use of the covariates. And then, as you said, in the breakouts, we'll get more into sort of, okay, what's some of the baseline monitoring and the research questions that the array could answer. So I'm opening it up to folks. I guess maybe if you want to stop sharing, that's okay. Unless, yeah, why don't you stop share and then we can maybe pop it back on if we need to. Okay, Kelsey.
What you're thinking about in terms of incorporating the tracking data? Are you thinking of weighting it for species that we have tracking data for, knowing that we have the tracking data that we have and that could inform, and then there's some that is missing, but is there a way you're going to weight that?
Did you get that, Wing?
Yep. Certainly open to discussions on how to incorporate that tracking data. It's tricky because we don't want to bring in multiple data sets for the same species, but that I was thinking that, let's say for sea ducks where we have some tracking data, could we look at the results of the MDAT analysis, say for displacement, and then overlay what we know from some tracking data, and can that basically help confirm or adjust the areas that we're considering have higher or lower, say, sea duck use? But that's more of approaching it from a sort of qualitative perspective. So sort of bringing in these two different data sets. There are ways to start to consider them together quantitatively, but it's tricky because they're very different kinds of information that are presenting different data in different ways. So we've been talking about it internally, and if you have some thoughts on how we might quantitatively do that, that would be great to hear.
Yeah, I guess I don't. I think it makes sense. What you're saying is that it's probably going to come down to a sort of an interpretive exercise in helping to confirm what we think is going on with MDAT data. So thanks, I appreciate that.
Thank you. Don, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Wing, on one of your slides, you talked about the proportion of the population exposed, kind of with on the spatial assessment slide. And I'm just curious what the scale of thought about population is. Is that the state population, the range-wide population, that could kind of change the mix a bit for certain species?
Yeah, great question. So most broadly, thinking about the population as represented in those MDAT models, which stretches from the Gulf of Maine down to Florida. But it's a reasonable question, and you could certainly confine that to just the Gulf of Maine, for example. It is another way that you could look at that. So would you feel if how you define your population is always a interesting discussion point. Do you have some thoughts on, would you, there are different ways to slice and dice it, right? You could also do it at, sort of in New England, down through New York. But the problem, of course, the populations are ranging different ways for different species. We're at the northernmost part of some species and southern for others. So that's sort of the trick of it. So yeah, what would your suggestion be?
I guess the species that prompted the question was roseate terns. And here in the Gulf of Maine, we have a small fraction of the range-wide or northeast population that's listed. But it would be worthwhile, I think, to be thinking about how our Gulf of Maine population uses the Gulf, because it is an important component, even if a small fraction of the total roseate tern population in the Northeast. So for that one, it seems like a more, quote, local focus might be warranted. I don't have a good answer for some of the, for example, species that don't breed in the Gulf, but spend significant time here, such as gannets or great shearwaters or others. It's a tough question. I was just curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, and there's no reason the idea is to try to distill this down as much as possible, but you can also look at it both ways. There's no reason we couldn't look at the Gulf of Maine and think a proportion of Gulf of Maine and then the proportion of the East Coast. You could do that separately, or you could also do both of those within the assessment and weigh them equally as you pull them in. So I think there could be a couple different ways you could do that.
I'm going to go quickly to a question that came up in the chat, and then I'll go to the hand that's up. Jeff asked, and this may be to you, Wing, or actually other people that are on the phone or on the Zoom. Do you see ways to expand the current monitoring technologies or the techniques to collect information on a very broad geographic area? Or a way that technologies can be reconfigured, or are there lab bench that might be used? Because it's noting, there's a fundamental lack of data, which could result in our slowing of the understanding of the impact of this growing Gulf of Maine offshore wind sector. And so what are your thoughts on that? And if others have thoughts on new technologies to help us learn more?
Yeah, for sure. So, when we think about trying to get this baseline data, we, at least I think towards sort of baseline surveys that are done sort of monthly or at least seasonally through entire area. And this sort of the traditional ways to do so are manned aerial flights and boat-based surveys. But the traditional observer aerial flights are just really too dangerous, and going offshore is difficult, and there's disturbance issues. So really it's come down to, at this point, is boat-based surveys and digital aerial surveys. And so digital aerial surveys are distinctly the preferred method to do large-scale surveys. And that is a newer technology. And there are pros and cons between boat and aerial, which could be a long discussion, but it sort of often depends on the scale of an area you're trying to monitor, and also the types of information that you're wanting to get at. So if you want a lot of behavioral information, there can be advantages from a boat, and boats usually are more sort of cost effective for a smaller area.
Got it. Thank you. Shiloh? Did you have your hand up?
I did. Yeah, I don't know that this is as important anymore since we've moved on, but just sort of building off of what Don Lyons was bringing up with scale and population scale. I'd be surprised if at a state level, folks in Maine wouldn't be more concerned with, looking at the local population size. So just as a thought experiment, I'm not saying that this is what the impacts would be, but if the impacts are 100% to the 100% of the roseate tern population in Maine, but that's still just a fraction of the overall roseate tern population, I think you have a problem if 100% of your roseate tern population in Maine is impacted. And thinking about it from maybe more of a hunting standpoint, even, if you're talking about, wintering waterfowl and sea ducks, if 100% of your Maine population of wintering sea ducks is affected, but that's only a fraction of the sea duck population in the Northeast, I think that the percentage of the Maine population that is impacted is really important, even if on a large population-wide scale, it might not be.
That's a good point. Thank you. Jocelyn.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Wing. If I can ask an uninformed question as not a bird or bat person, I'm wondering if there are certain species that are ESA listed that we really need to focus on, or how we're going to, or what the conversations are around prioritizing different species to look at within this array.
Sure, yeah. So there are 3 key ESA species from a bird perspective. We have roseate tern, piping plover, and red knot, and then northern long-eared bat from bat perspective. So for roseate terns, they are included in the MDAT. We do have some models for them, so we can use that to help our assessment. For piping plovers and red knots, there's been some tracking work that's been done that can help inform. But for them, they are going to be passing through the area likely during migration, and there's probably not a huge difference on how they are using different parts of the area of interest overall. For the terns, we do have that MDAT data, and that would be kind of what we would depend upon. There's been some tracking work as well, which would also contribute to that. And in that population vulnerability piece, because roseate tern is long-lived and endangered, it gets right up to the top. So it's going to be weighed probably one of the heaviest out of any species, if not the heaviest.
Thank you, Wing. We're creeping into our time, but I do want to have an opportunity for Tim if you have a question, and then last call before we move on to the next piece of our agenda here.
Hello, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Just kind of a brainstorming question for Wing. Just trying to imagine how the data on fishing grounds and the most sort of valuable fishing grounds, the overlap with the available habitat, wildlife habitat use data. Is there a way to, have you thought about trying to use the fishing ground usage data as a predictor of habitat use in unobserved areas? You have these kind of sparse data, but humans and wildlife tend to use habitat for the same reasons, which is to get food.
Yeah.
So you could potentially use fishing data as a predictor of unobserved wildlife habitat.
Yes, absolutely. And, I'm following very carefully what Carl and DMR are doing, because I see that as being really informative. And I think what's good is, at least for some species, we're already starting to see that correlation of higher predicted use areas in, say, around Platts Bank and those areas. So it's sort of an ongoing discussion on how, again, it's this question, do you quantitatively bring them together, or do you maybe sort of do more simple overlays? But absolutely, the fisheries is going to be hugely informative. And I think it's a very safe assumption to say areas of highest fishing use is areas that are also going to have heavy bird use, at least for some species.
Thanks. I'll just quickly add, I'm a marine scientist with a lot of interest in wind development. So very interesting information. Thank you.
Thank you. I also wanted to note, if people haven't been looking at the chat, there were some comments made in terms of the other important species that Arctic tern, Maine supports about 94% of the birds, and Atlantic puffin and razorbills, where Maine is the only state to support the nesting populations of those 2 species. So again, that issue that Shiloh brought up, it might only be the percentage of population that happens in a certain space is important as we look at potential impacts. Jeff, I'm going to have you have a last question, but before I do, I want to make sure people are thinking, and if you came in late, we are going to have a breakout in a little while. If you could go to the participants and put either a BB or an MM in front of your name, that can help Cameron as he's putting together the breakouts that'll happen a little bit later. So thank you for those of you that have already done that, but there's a quick reminder of a little homework for those of you that are joining on. And if you want to participate in those breakouts, that will help us do that when that comes up. Jeff.
Thank you, Laura. I have a question that is not related to birds, and I am going to admit that I don't have the agenda handy, so I'm not sure. Can you remind me what the next agenda item is? There was a question I wanted to ask before we went to break, and I'm not sure if now's the right time to do it or not. So what's next?
What's next is we are going to have a little conversation around considering the array configuration. So
Okay.
once you think about how the turbines may be in space and time, what are some of the things we should be considering from a wildlife perspective?
All right. Well, maybe this will be instructive before then, so I'll ask it now.
Go for it.
So I appreciated that Carl presented some information on whales. He had the Baleen distribution map from the portal, and then some things. I believe there was a seasonal map on right whale distributions within the blob. But I am just curious whether this group is going to have the opportunity to hear any more information about whale use in the area, particularly with some of the ones of higher concern, humpbacks or right whales. We've had a little bit, not a lot, and I just didn't know if the state or anybody else was going to be providing any additional information for this group on whale use in the area.
Carl or Aaron, do you want to take that question? I think if you're going to jump into the marine mammal breakout, we might be able to address that at that point. But if Carl or Aaron are on the line and want to address that now in terms of is what we, I think is what we have is part of your question.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's definitely in our conversation, and Aaron Summers is on our staff and is our lead marine mammal biologist. And so it's definitely, you know, that knowledge base is definitely going to be into our thought process around siting. Is there an opportunity to bring more expertise in front of this group? We haven't talked directly about that, but if there's a need, I'm sure we could do it.
Thank you, Carl.
Thanks, Carl.
All right. Well, thank you, Wing. That was really helpful. And I look forward to sort of seeing how that comes together as you look at those different ways to think about the MDAT data and the other pieces that can help inform potential places for interaction. And as you said, just the absence of data doesn't mean that something's not there. It just means there's an absence of data, which seems to be a perpetual problem in many ways. I'm going to ask Amanda if she would just share a few slides, or Cameron, I think you've got the slides, but we're going to move on into a brief conversation around thinking about the research array and your initial thoughts on the design and the considerations around what the layout might look like. So if you could tee that up for us, Amanda, and then we can have a little Q&A about that.
Yeah, you bet. So switching gears a little bit here. So in thinking about array configuration, I guess I want to define upfront what we mean by configuration for this discussion. So what we mean by that is the layout of the turbines themselves. So like what shape will they take as they're compiled together? Then also thinking about the orientation. So what direction will they lay? Will they be aligned at a north-south axis, east-west, at a diagonal? So think about those two elements of configuration. We'll see some examples of those in a second. One more piece before we look at some graphics here is that to keep in mind, at this stage of our conversation, we're really thinking about the general features of configuration. We're not talking about a final layout or micrositing. That would have to come later down the road. But at this point, we're really trying to gather information on if a certain general configuration is preferable to another based on two perspectives. One, the potential impacts to wildlife, and two, the potential to ask some different research questions. So next slide, please. I am not a technical expert or engineer. So I am not going to go into deep dive into this graphic here. This one has been shared in other webinars, and you can find more information on it on the Energy Office's website if you would like more information. But the reason I'm presenting it here is that as we have this discussion around configurations, I'd like you to keep in mind, and you probably already have this in your minds, that we're talking about the elements of turbines that are both above the water as well as the elements that are below the water, and the different things that might interact with them above and below and both. We're using 1 mile as a starting point for the spacing between the turbines, but that's something that we'll discuss as part of this session as well. Next slide, please. I like visuals. So to help get us around what this actually looks like as we're thinking about configuration, here is a generated image of what a pod of turbines might look like set together. The circles are not to scale. Don't interpret those as watch circles, but they're drawn really to draw your attention to where the turbines are sitting on the water. So this is to just help get our minds into the setting of thinking about what we're trying to visualize here. Okay, next slide. Okay, I'm going to walk us through this slowly. So what you see here are 3 generalized layouts and orientations to consider as we kick off our discussion. So again, I want you to keep in mind 2 things as you're thinking about these. Is there a certain configuration that we might expect could minimize potential impacts to wildlife? Again, thinking about both above and below the water. Then the second question is there a certain configuration that allows us to answer research questions that can be scaled up to assess potential impacts of larger commercial size projects? So I'm going to walk us through these 3 different potential layouts. Okay, on the left-hand side of your screen, number 1, where you see pods. And just first, before I go into this, these are not drawn to scale. Think of them for now as representing a mile in between. And I see there's a comment in the chat box about that we can talk about in a second. But think about these generally as being about 1 mile in between each turbine, not drawn to scale. Each dot represents a turbine. So that first potential layout, the one labeled pods, what that is showing is a layout of 3 pods that consist of 4 turbines each. The graphic that looks like little Tetris pieces at the bottom left hand of that rectangle, basically that's showing the orientation of those pods. So you can orient them in different ways with sort of the 2 pods along the south end with 1 pod at the north end. You could have them angled, you could have them flipped. So that's to give you an idea of both the layout and then the orientation of pods. The second graphic that you see there in the middle, it shows a line of turbines. Those could be oriented, as you're seeing in the bottom left-hand side of that rectangle. They could be oriented horizontally, vertically, diagonally. So along a north-south axis, east-west, along a diagonal, northeast to southwest, etc. On the far right-hand side, that's an array layout. So basically, that's where all the turbines are arranged together. Again, we can think about them being arranged together sort of along, again, the north-south axis, diagonally, east to west, etc. While you're seeing a square presented here, that's also just a kind of a generalized idea for us to talk about. There are other shapes to consider. For example, a circle might allow us to answer different questions about edge effects and the effects of being in the center versus being in the exterior of the array as well. We can also, although it's not shown here, we can also talk about combining some of these. So for example, having a set of pods as well as a line configuration. So I'm presenting these as a starting place for the conversation as we talk about what might be some of the ideal configurations from both, again, a wildlife perspective, impact perspective, as well as the research question perspective. So I'm going to turn it back over to Laura to walk us through what we'll actually try to get at here in the discussion.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. I appreciate it. So we're really seeking some input on, as Amanda said, configuration to the extent that it affects the lease shaping and the siting, and what's the orientation you know, as of the different potential configurations, and then also spatial distribution. There was a question about the 1 mile. I'm trying to find out if it is actually 1 mile or 1 nautical mile, but we can get a technical answer to that. But that was just a starting point in order to have a visual. But the real, there's an opportunity should the turbines be closer or farther apart. What does that mean? Are there advantages or disadvantages from a wildlife perspective? So I want to just open it up to the group. As you looked at those different layout options, are there particular ones that you thought might, and again, those are just 3. What could the layout look like that would reduce risks to wildlife? Why? What would be your thought process around that? And then also, what would you want to consider around a layout that might help you answer different research questions? I would just go back, if you go back to one particular slide to show the layout options. Oops. That first one with the pods, that was an idea that, in fact, the fishing industry in southern New England has talked a lot about. We really need transit lanes. And so if you want to explore the idea of transit lanes, those areas in between are actually 2 miles in between those pods. So again, a layout could help answer some different research questions on the wildlife side as well. And let's have a conversation about what are your different thoughts. So I think we'll unshare for now. And there is a question. I'm not sure if we have the right people to answer the question, but it's something we can certainly make sure we find out, which, are there examples of other types of large scale infrastructure that's applied configurations chosen to minimize impact in wildlife? So, that's the special distribution grids presented are complete construction slab operation biased. That's one of the thoughts. So I think that's a great question. What can we learn are there others that have been used to minimize wildlife impacts, and can this research project be used to focus on that? Tim.
Hi, thank you. Just a brainstorm thought that came to mind that I don't necessarily have an answer for is the pods versus the lines could have, if you're considering flocking birds, for example, a long line of turbines could potentially impact flocking birds more than those that are kind of spaced out. So the pod design might allow kind of a corridor for some birds to pass through. So just a thought out loud.
Nope, that's great. There was a question about, is 12 the magic turbine number for the research array or just a discussion number? It is probably somewhere between 10 and 12. It will depend on the turbine size from what I understand, but it's not set in stone by any stretch in terms of the actual number. I don't know, Selena, if I didn't answer that correctly, shake your head at me, but it is the operating number at this point.
Yeah, it'll be 12 or fewer turbines, and within 16 square miles, we'll work within that space to see what makes the most sense from a technical and standpoint.
Great, thank you. Shiloh?
Yeah, thanks. I don't want to sound defeatist here, so I apologize if that's how it comes off. But I'm sort of thinking that just like in the location process, it seems that the fisheries concerns and the spatial, the locations on a spatial scale of what parts are important for lobster fishing and other types of fisheries kind of outweighs, like that's the first step. And then we're just sort of trying to find a space that maybe works for wildlife in this leftover area. And I think that's just the reality that we're dealing with. I think that's going to be the case on the configuration too. And so I can only speak from a bird perspective and from what I know on a bird perspective, but my thinking is that our input is going to be less important in this decision anyway. And I would rather, I think that the spacing be closer together so that it's taking up less space in the marine environment, but that's not going to be the reality. And that's why the 1 nautical mile has been chosen for other projects. It wasn't with a nod to wildlife, as far as I understand. It was because we wanted to allow for vessel traffic so that fisheries could still fish within those areas.
I do know related to the distance and whether it's one or others, that the larger and taller the turbine is, the further apart you need to put them for the wash effect. I've been told that. So there are many things that sort of play into that big distance question.
Right, but none of them have to do with whether or not it's better for birds, right? Like we might learn something about it from the bird perspective and learn about whether or not more birds come into that area. But I don't think we know enough to say that, larger spacing is better, and it does potentially increase displacement effects.
So from your perspective, maybe closer, the closer you could have them might be the better option.
Yeah, I think also just from a bird perspective, we need to be focusing more on the monitoring that we're going to do to understand what those impacts are and potentially mitigate for those impacts, as opposed, I'm just trying to be realistic here.
And we will certainly be getting to that in our breakout session. I wanted to note that Wing did put something in here about a paper that modeled bird movement based on array configuration, and maybe that can be informative to us. I think, Kelsey, I think you had your hand up next. I might have lost track. And then I have John Williamson and Jocelyn and Kate Williams.
Yeah, thank you. When I had seen those 3 options, my first gut reaction was, thinking about migratory birds, and I thought the linear configuration positioned, and then you'd never be able to predict exactly the routes and things, but you could look at predominant winds or current or something like that. It may not be a direct north-south configuration. It might be a north-northeast, south-southeast. But then when Tim talked about flocking birds, that made me think a little more about it. And I just drew up something that is kind of a hybrid of the pod and the linear 6 in the line double, where you'd have 6 above, 2 miles in between, and 6 below. So you'd have the linear configuration, but you'd still have a 2-mile spread between the 2 pods, which are linear pods. So you'd have transit and also potentially address flocking concerns. So, and you'd still be within that 12 miles or 16 miles squared footprint. So that was just a thought I had, especially after Tim mentioned flocking.
Yep. So I heard a sort of like a 6x6 linear pods, and really thinking about how wind and the wind patterns impact configuration.
Yeah, except not 6x6, but 3x2 above another 3x2, but 2 miles in between.
Got it.
Basically 3x2 on top of each other. Yeah.
Got it. I was thinking 6 over 6, but thank you.
Yep.
Feel free to draw it and send it as well, because all these ideas are important to put into the mix of consideration. John Williamson.
Yeah, Laura, just to make a note on the realities of the layouts that we've seen in southern New England. I mean, there they've adopted a regular grid pattern at the behest of the local fishing industry, but that's not necessarily what's going to happen here in the Gulf of Maine. And so if it isn't what happens here in the Gulf of Maine, what the wind companies prefer to do is design around prevailing winds and the wake effect, and the configurations that are their ideal configurations, which gain another 10%, is what I've been told, or have the potential to gain another 10% as far as electricity generated. is far more random looking than any of these examples, and really is oriented to the prevailing winds and seasonal shifts in the prevailing winds. No, I'll just note that. And then the other thing is that these, what happens below the water is, it would be nice if these diagrams anticipated what happens below the water, because the scope on the anchorage, depending on the technology used, is going to expand those footprints quite a bit below the water.
Great points. Thank you, John, for sharing your experience. Absolutely. What happens below the water and some kind of 3D way of representing that. I think I had Jocelyn and then Kate.
Yeah, I think to the point of what's happening below the water, I appreciate the need to sort of reduce the footprint of the overall array, but I would be concerned about really tightly clustered arrays in marine mammal, especially large mammals navigating the anchoring systems, given that they have 3 anchor points per each, and then the cabling line going down. So just something, I don't have any other thoughts other than that.
Thank you. There's certainly a lot to weigh and consider. I appreciate everyone's thoughts. Kate?
Yeah, thank you. Building off of both John and Shiloh said, it would be good to think through what the most likely configuration would be for larger scale commercial floating projects, and try to imitate that as much as we can to get an initial idea of what reactions from wildlife are likely to be. So if that's 1 nautical mile spacing in a grid like it is south of here for monopile projects, then I would argue to try and do that and keep them all in a block so that we can understand how wildlife are going to react to it. I don't know if that's the case for the floating foundations. Maybe there's some larger spacing or something different that makes more sense in terms of allowing fishing around floating foundations. But I mean, from a bird perspective, I think one of the big questions in relation to configuration is whether with these much larger turbines that are spaced much farther apart than a lot of projects in Europe, whether birds will be responding to individual turbines or whether they will still perceive it as a full array. If they're far enough apart, they may stop reacting to it as an entire wind farm and just start reacting to individual turbines. We don't know the answer to that. And so trying to space them in a way that is as realistic as possible for what we think might happen in the future with these larger scale commercial projects, I think would be the most helpful for trying to answer that question.
Thank you, Kate, for that thought. Jeff?
Thanks, Laura. I had a question with respect to some of the research work that's going to be done in the array. And I asked it on the last fisheries group call. Selena gave me a tentative or a preliminary response, and I wanted to go ahead and ask it again. And that is, I do think that there is opportunity for research around the different anchoring systems and the differing impacts on various aspects of the project based on the anchoring system. And I was curious whether we could try to test different anchoring systems within the research array to compare those impacts. And I had an assumption, which I don't know if is true, is whether you need different substrate in order to test the different anchoring systems. And if you do, then what my question was is whether all of the turbines had to be in one, whether the lease area had to be one continuous block, or whether you might be able to try and do it in 2 separate blocks so that you might be able to try anchoring in different substrates to better understand the different impacts depending on what the substrate is you are anchoring in and what type of anchoring system you're actually using because of the substrate you're in. So Selena or anybody else, is there any further guidance on whether this does actually have to be one contiguous lease area or whether we might be able to go into 2 to try to test some different substrates?
My opinion at the moment, based on the conversations that we are having, is I think I have a preference for one area as opposed to two to minimize areas that are being impacted. But if there are strong opinions or views otherwise, I think that's something that would be willing to have a discussion on. Jeff, you asked the question last time. I haven't heard the other people bring this up. So if people feel strongly about that, would like to hear that and understand the rationale for it too. I think that there certainly is a willingness to explore opportunities for technology differences. There's a lot of engineering that goes into designing these, and so we just have to be thoughtful about the practicalities of specifically how we can make adjustments between the different turbines within the array. But I believe there is a desire to have some capacity to do that testing. And regarding the different anchoring techniques in requiring different substrates, that's where that's beyond my knowledge at the moment. If anyone else on the call wants to weigh in, they can, but I'm happy to get back to you on that, Jeff. I think that there's a preference for certain types of anchoring systems to match certain bathymetry, but there may be some ability to cross there. I'm not quite sure.
Thanks, Helene. I appreciate that. I assumed that was the case, but I figured I'd just ask just to make sure. Thanks.
Chris, do you want to weigh in on the anchoring?
Yeah, sure. I think that's right. I mean, I just want to reflect the state of the industry in floating is that there isn't actually standard operating procedure yet. There are so few wind turbines, and it's so site specific that I think we'd be keenly interested in trying different both anchoring and mooring line configurations. I suspect that we are going to find different substrate even in one contiguous area. I also think that I totally support Selena in desiring one area, and that if two, I think they just economically need to be quite near one another because the cost of cable gets to be expensive pretty quick. Right, so I could imagine a 2-mile separation, but not a 10-mile separation, right?
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate you weighing in with your technical expertise there and your thoughts. I want to go, Kate, you still have your hand up, but I assume you wanted to have it down. But Tom, and then I think it looks like Joycelyn put her hand back up. And then we need to move on if people are okay. We're actually we're getting into our break. So I do want to give at least everyone a 10-minute stretch break before we get into what I think people are already beginning to think about, which is, okay, what are the research ideas around what do we need to know for baseline data, and what do we have for thoughts on how the array could be used to answer research questions, thinking about larger scale commercial coming down the road. So Tom.
Good afternoon. So I worked as a research vessel captain in the Gulf of Maine for some universities, and I've also operated commercial towing vessels through the lease area. I'm also an aquaculture company owner in Casco Bay, and I'm working as an engineer for a marine renewable power company. So I'm not a scientist, but I've been nearby to science for quite a while, and I just wanted to bring a different perspective to the discussion today, which would be great to get some science feedback on. I've noticed that if this was a short-term isolated project, the conservation approach, minimizing interactions, I think is appropriate. Stepping back and looking at the bigger offshore wind picture, it's growing exponentially. They're hoping to put 800 megawatts in the Gulf of Maine, which are hundreds of turbines. So I'd be interested in hearing a scientific discussion about taking a calculated risk to inform the location and the number of turbines with regards to species interactions. What I'm thinking is this is an opportunity to get the bull by the horns and collect data that will inform the conservation picture later, and attach kind of a scientific feedback loop to the arc of this industry. to try to keep things growing in a way where a natural resource like offshore wind doesn't have the chance to go down the same natural resource kind of path that we've seen with forestry and a whole bunch of other natural resources. So yeah, is it a good opportunity to say we want to have interactions? Why don't we place these turbines somewhere where we're going to find out, hey, certain species behave this way, and now when we go to expand to the level of hundreds, we have the data in hand to really make sure that that picture is most appropriate. Thank you.
So I don't know if there's anyone in particular who wants to address that question. It's a great question, and I think it's something that the group put out at the first session. I think there was quite a conversation about that. In terms of the overall siting, the goal is to try to have minimum impact in the site that's selected. I think where we are now is also then in the layout, though. Kate has put forward the idea that, gee, if we're going to use this is a research site that needs to help us understand larger commercial, and has advocated for the idea that it should be as close to what that commercial might look like. And then I see other comments that say, no, that's something that we should across the board be trying to minimize all impacts, and therefore the layout should consider first and foremost limiting impacts. So it's a great question. I think there are multiple, sounds like at least two scientists that have opinions about that on either side. John and Carl, actually, I'll have you go first. Do you want to respond or share your thoughts from a scientific perspective?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is my perspective is relative to the research array. The size of it is simply much different than a full-scale commercial array, and frankly, the process is much different than the full-scale research array. So if BOEM was to release a lease area, it doesn't feel like they would have the same opportunities that we are having to minimize it. It's going to be much more of a regional discussion rather than a small scale discussion. Just my reaction to that.
Thanks, Carl. John, with you've got a lot of experience here. What is your thought?
Well, I'll keep it real short. I think Tom just hit the nail on the head as far as the opportunity for this initiative. I mean, there is so much data. There's so many questions surrounding all the stuff that's going on south of Cape Cod in the mid-Atlantic. Our opportunity here is to get some of these questions framed and answered now before the actual development in the Gulf of Maine takes off, and that's going to happen. So I mean, to define those research questions and design this small array around the best way to answer some of these key questions, that's the opportunity as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, John. I hope I didn't cut anyone off, but I do want to have us have at least a 10-minute break. We'll keep it just to 10 minutes if that's okay. So we'll come back at 3:25, and we will be getting exactly into this conversation, which is, okay, what are some of those research ideas that we can have this array answer as we anticipate something bigger commercial for floating. So I will go ahead and ask, I guess, Cameron, if you can put up the slide. There's a break slide. If you haven't had an opportunity, this is a good opportunity to put a BB or MM in front of your name. We're going to come back to the plenary first before breakouts. So I will see you all shortly. Thank you. Thank you to those who might have come back on the line, and Cameron, if you want to stop the screen share. Appreciate everyone who has hung in with us on a Friday afternoon, and really want to thank everyone for their thoughtful comments here. It's been really, really helpful. As someone had said, you know, this is all about thinking about minimizing impacts, and what are those trade-offs as the research array is considered as a potential opportunity to learn more about floating offshore wind. So without further ado, I want to actually turn it over back to Amanda. Amanda's going to share a little bit about frame us up in terms of the original thoughts or some of the initial ideas about what the research framework could look like. And then we'll go into breakouts and have an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper, both into the birds and bats area and the marine mammal area. And again, if you didn't have an opportunity to try to put a BB or MM before your name, that would be terrific. So Amanda, I think Cameron has your slides, correct?
Yes, yeah, that would be great, Cameron, if you could pull those up. Yeah, and thank you, Laura, and thanks, like you said, for everybody sticking through this here through the last hour. So I really appreciate all the comments and feedback we've been getting in the chat box and both verbally. This last portion of our agenda is going to focus on research themes and questions that we want to ask as part of this project. And I just want to kind of put a finer point on the impact piece, where from the state of Maine's perspective, we want to put forth a project proposal that minimizes impacts to wildlife. I understand the conversations that came up in the last section of this call here about testing different configurations, but from our state's perspective, we want to minimize any impacts that this research array would have on wildlife. So next slide, please, Cameron. So as we've discussed throughout the process here, the primary driver of the project is indeed to answer key research questions about floating wind technology in the Gulf of Maine. And so as part of that, these discussions we are having here today will inform the lease application that we'll be putting in. It will help inform the siting considerations, design, and layout. So this also feeds into the overall process that's a part of the offshore wind strategic planning effort that's called the roadmap. You can learn more about that on the offshore wind website, but just to let you know that this is sort of this research project is the first step in what is a longer multi-year planning effort to consider offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine. The ultimate goal of all of this is to create a stakeholder-driven process where we can have these conversations, ultimately do some research, and be able to provide that research in an open format to everybody. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through these quickly because I know we're a little bit past time. But when we're talking about research, I know as a scientist, my mind automatically goes to wildlife species. But when we're talking about research for this overall project, we're really talking about a broad scope of different themes that we're hoping to learn from. You can see a list of them there in front of you on the screen, but we're really thinking about considerations from a technological side, as well as interactions with fishing activities, socioeconomic considerations, workforce and education, and other topics that might come up. So while our discussions today really are focused on that first bullet, please keep in mind there's a broader array of questions that we're thinking about. And as we talk about those ecological things today, as other ideas come up that pertain to socioeconomics and other things, we'll keep a list of those so we're keeping them on the radar of things to consider. I also want to talk about sort of the scope of stuff that's being considered, and to keep in mind that with this broad list of different themes, research themes that are being considered, we can't answer all of them. We can't do all of them. So also keep in the back of your mind, what are those really key questions that you want to answer as part of this project? Next slide, please. Okay, so this is sort of my last one before Laura takes it over to get us into breakouts. But as we go into breakouts, keep in mind kind of two fundamental questions. Really what we have the opportunity here to do is to take a step back and think, this is a new technology in the Gulf of Maine. What are those big questions that we don't know that might be unique to this place, that might be unique to this technology? So questions here to consider. What information do we want to have to inform those bigger projects down the road? What do we need to ask right now to help us understand impacts later? What concerns do we have here that are relevant to offshore wind generally, not just this particular project? And also, what are the methodologies we can use to try to understand those impacts? So thinking broadly, what are those broad floating offshore wind questions that we can try to answer through this project? And how can we go about answering those questions? So with that in mind, I'm going to turn us back to Laura, who will go through kind of the logistics of the breakout piece of this meeting.
That was fantastic because you got us back on track, Amanda. I really appreciate it. Good job. I think we can drop the slide, Cameron. So hopefully most of you have been able to go to the participants and rename yourself. If you haven't, Cameron can help you if you can directly chat him on which breakout groups you want to go to. And as Amanda said, we really want to think about both two broad questions. Sort of one is, I know people already brought up sort of what's the baseline data and initial monitoring we need to do to be considered even prior to a project being operated for this research array. But then what are the key questions should the research array investigate so we can better understand what's the interaction between floating technology and floating turbines and wildlife and the marine environment, and inform any potential future development, whether it's here or abroad, because there's been very little floating technology that's been put in the water. So there's an opportunity to learn a lot and inform others about what has been learned. So we have David Plum on the line. I don't think I've introduced you yet, David, but David's with Consensus Building Institute. And he is going to go with Andy Clement from Maine is going to take notes. So we won't be recording the breakout groups from an audio standpoint, but we will be making sure that notes are being taken. And David's going to facilitate that group. And then I will go with Corey Stearns is going to take notes for our group in the birds and the bats. And in the chat, Cameron has a set again, you can just direct message him. So we're going to spend a little time together in our breakouts and then come back and wind it up for the day with a quick report out and then closing. So I will try to remind you all when we have 5-minute warning so we can wrap it up in your breakout session. And I will remind David and others that there is a Google spreadsheet if people, as they're talking, want to also just put ideas in a spreadsheet. We can be doing that as well. So multiple ways to provide input. And I really appreciate you all sticking on for the breakout piece of the conversation tonight. So Cameron, without further ado, I think you're the one that does the magic.
Cameron, can you put me in with the marine mammals if possible?
Okay. Yes, for whoever who's left in this room, you can just let me know right now which one you would like to go to, either birds and bats or marine mammals.
Hey, this is Jack Merrill. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Thanks. I guess I'd go with the bird group.
All right, I'll send you right there.
Thank you.
I can hear you with the sirens. Where would you like to go?
This is Brad Allen. I'd like to go with birds and bats, please.
All right, I'll send you there right now.
Thank you very much.
And Chris Wisman, I guess I'll join marine mammals.
Okay. Almost.
This is Chris Orphanides. I put the wrong thing in mine. I'd like to go to marine mammals if possible. I have fixed it now, but
okay.
Cameron, this is Tony. You can put me in marine mammals too, please.
All right.
This is Jared Canolti. Same for me, please.
All right. Jericho, do you see an option to join breakout room? I believe I already put you there. Not sure if it's on your screen at all.
I was kicked. I don't know. The Zoom meeting stopped and then it told me it was a bad internet connection and to retry. So that might have been my, oh, breakout rooms. Oh, sorry. I see it.
No
My
problem.
bad. I'll go.
Meredith, I see that you're there, but I'm not sure if you're watching a session, but if you would like to join either of the breakout rooms, just let me know. Hello, whoever just joined by phone. Everybody's in breakout sessions right now for birds and bats or marine mammals. So which breakout session would you like to take a part of for the remaining time?
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I got calling in and I had a drop call. Can you put me back in the bird and bat group?
Sure thing.
Thank you.
concerns about particular species that we need to think about. And then we had a little conversation about lighting and what the kind of impacts that lighting has on birds. And maybe we can think about some different ways of lighting and different ways to be considering that in this particular research array. And again, I'm sure I didn't do the conversation complete justice, but Amanda, did I miss any key theme that you heard?
Nope, that all sounded good.
I see a shaking of the head. So
I'll do a quick shout out, Laura, with two other things that just people mentioned I don't want to miss, though, was a deep sea coral question, understanding if there are issues there. And obviously any issues around vertical lines in the water column that are specifically related to offshore wind, understanding that, consider all the concerns around vertical lines right now.
Yeah, those are all imperfect. And one thing that did strike me is thinking that with what we know about research, as the turbines get bigger, their rotor diameter gets bigger, and so there is the collision impact being something that's of a great concern. We need to consider that as well in terms of past research and what we can learn now with new research with larger turbines might be different. So with that, David, if you could help us walk through the Mentimeter so that we can get a sort of sense of just of the conversation we've had today, which again is the start of many conversations. You know, what's the most compelling research question or issue that folks heard that might rise to the surface? So there's a Mentimeter we're going to use to do that.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Laura. So in addition to all the notes that are being taken, of everything that's being said, and all the good ideas are going to be put in the Google Doc and elsewhere, right? That is being captured. We would like to get a sense if there is some alignment around some kind of priority amongst all these good ideas, right? So Cameron's going to throw in the chat right now a link to a question, and you click on that link. He just dropped it in, and it's asked you this question. Take a moment to answer it. And one of the interesting things about using this system here, you click on the link, and then you click on Open Q&A, right? So you click on Open Q&A, it'll open up a browser, right? And the question is, as Laura says, of everything we've just been talking about on research questions, what really, for you, if you had to distill it, what's really most compelling about a research question that could be related to this array that would help Maine get ready? And once people start to answer it, you'll see other people's answers, and you can click on the other people's answers to kind of upvote them, right? So once you've taken a moment to thought about it, you wrote it, you submitted, you'll probably start to see other people's answers, and look at that for a little bit. And the ones that you feel really compelled by, put a little star next to that as well, a little upclick vote, and that way we can start to see it, right? So we're starting to see a couple come across, right? Somebody wrote in Gulf of Maine Scale Comprehensive Wildlife Survey. If that seems like something that's compelling to you, click on that little thumbs up, right, to upvote it. And let's just let this run for a little bit. If anybody's having a hard time using it, just shout out or let us know if it's giving you a hard time. We'll just let it run. Think about something you want to write. Look at what other people are writing. Go ahead and click on that little thumbs up thing. If you click on it a second time, it'll take it away. So just click on it once. You can't give it more than 1 star. One thing we might be able to do, Cameron, is if you want to share your screen with a nice view of this scrolling up, and people, that way if people aren't in their browser, they can still see it here on the Zoom. We're just going to let this go for a second. Cameron, do you have a view that allows you to see a few more things at the same time?
I can only do one at a time, David.
Okay. So what I'm doing is I'm just looking at that browser window now and seeing the ideas go by, right? And if you find them, particularly if you're doing the same thing as I am, you can just click on them and say, yep, that's absolutely one of my priorities as well, right? Someone just wrote in deep sea corals. Someone else wrote in real-time follows or tagging of marine mammals to see how they interact around the turbines. Right, this is the screen I'm looking at. I'll just share my screen for 1 second. If you can let me do that, Cameron. And then we'll finish this up. With folks who aren't in a browser window, this is what I'm looking at as they come across. And if we look at the ones that have gotten the most votes, right? What are the behavior changes for wildlife with respect to the array? Gulf of Maine scale comprehensive wildlife survey. What are the abundance and distribution of birds in and around the research array? Right? These are the kinds of comments that are getting a lot of enthusiasm from you all. Real-time automated data collection using latest technologies related to wildlife presence and migration. Great. So if you are able to, in your browser, you can scroll around a little bit like what I'm doing. Look at these. Okay. Great. So let's pause it there to say this is really helpful. Thanks for doing this. Feel free to keep browsing through and if you're able to look at that in your browser. Excellent. Okay, so the purpose of that again is to see where in all of you, where there really are points of emphasis. And I think that was clear, right? There's some clear points of emphasis that are particularly important. And so that's helpful to take away from this conversation. Laura, other things you want to do to finish us off, finish up the session today?
Absolutely. Thank you, David. That was really helpful for you to lead us through that. Amanda has a couple slides or maybe 1 or 2 slides to share at the end. I think it's 1 slide. Cameron, if you can put up, I think it's an arrow. And then we can close out.
Great, thank you, Laura. I realize I'm standing between you and your weekend, so I'll make this quick. So first of all, I wanted to thank you all for your time and the rich ideas that you contributed during this session, at the first session, and all the homework that you did in between. Right now, we're the red dot in the middle of the arrow. And so I point that out because there's more to come. We've wrapped up this second session, but over the next month, we're going to continue to compile additional data sets, research ideas that you put into that Google Doc form. All of that will be happening here over the next month. Also keep in mind that sometime in April, we're hoping to have those joint workshops with the fisheries sessions to talk about common areas of overlap. But what I want you to also think about is that this arrow continues. It doesn't just end here at the edge of your screen. We're just in the very, very early stages of planning around offshore wind, and Maine is committed to continuing stakeholder conversations around this planning. Please continue to stay engaged. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you need more information on how best to continue the conversations around offshore wind planning. Feel free to email me directly. You'll see my contact information on the final slide here. Give me a call. Just let me know how best you can engage and we can help provide you with that information. And with that, thank you again for your time, and I'll turn it over to Laura to wrap us up.
Thank you, Amanda. There's not much more I can add to that. I would go to the next slide so everyone can see our closing slide there. Would echo your thanks to everyone for sticking with it today, especially for those of you that have participated last time and this time. Again, we will continue. What you can expect from us is that we will be summarizing this meeting. We will be bringing all the information together and making sure it rolls forward, as Amanda said, through the arrow that will continue on as we all start to learn and explore on what the impact of offshore wind could mean to those of us in Maine, and what those opportunities and impacts are that we need to consider thoughtfully and with stakeholders as we move forward. So with that, I think we are, I would encourage everyone to continue to look at that website. New information is coming up on there. We have had some 2 very good webinars, and there will be additional opportunities for us to jointly be learning. And the recording from this will be up there, as well as summary notes. And I really appreciate everyone's input and thoughtful comments today. And we look forward to continuing to work with you as this, as we work together. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great weekend.
Absolutely. Stay in touch, please.